Donc, voilà, donc l'enregistrement est lancé si vous voulez. Laura O'Brien is a PhD candidate at the Peter Guo Fu School of Architecture in McGill. She's supervised by Anne-Marie Adams. She also holds an MA in art history at Concordia University. And her work is supported by the CRSH and FRQSA and also Montreal History Group. She's now in Sweden, so it's 6 o'clock, I think, there. Her dissertation explores the architectural network of poor relief for women between the 1880s and 1920s in Montreal. And she reads this architectural landscape through the Women's Christian Temperance Union Sheltering Home Register, which is a source that she's going to talk about in her presentation today. So now I'll turn the floor over to Laura for her presentation on this exciting subject.
Great, thank you so much, Paul-Étienne, and thank you everyone for coming. I'm going to share my screen now before I start talking and forget. Okay. And I'll go to, can everyone see full screen and everything? All right, super. So thank you so much everyone for coming. I'm really thrilled to have the opportunity to present my dissertation research at Muffins and Methodology to members of the Montreal History Group. The scholarship that's come out of this group and that has been published by members of this group has been very important to my research and learning about Montreal. So I'm really glad to be here. And this presentation is also comes at a good and a bad time because shortly after Paul-Étienne invited me to present, I actually lived what I think is every academic's worst nightmare. And I tried to do a software update and lost a couple of months of hard work. In the software update, I had to erase my hard drive. So this presentation was a really great opportunity to refocus and kind of regroup my research after that devastating event. And yes, as Paul-Étienne mentioned, if you have any questions in French afterwards, I will do my best to answer them as well. But I'm going to be giving the presentation in English. So I'm talking about my dissertation in progress today, where I look at the architectural network of poor relief in Montreal through the WCTU Sheltering Home Register. I'm going to start by introducing the register, even though I know that some of you are probably familiar with the document already. And then I'm going to move to the sheltering home itself. And then I'm going to discuss some findings from the chapter that I'm working on right now and discuss some of the methods that I'm using. So the register is a delicate object. As you can see here on screen, it's tied together with a piece of string and it's wrapped in this delicate tissue paper. I was first introduced to the register in 2014 by my dissertation supervisor, Anne-Marie Adams, while I was doing my master's. It's part of the Sheltering Home of Montreal Fond at the McCord Archives and Documentation Center, along with a visitor book and a minutes book that were recorded by the managers of this institution. The pages of the register are very fragile, and when you turn the pages, they kind of like crumble and turn into dust as you're going through it. But despite the fragility of this document, it holds a whole wealth of information. It records over 3,000 entries into the sheltering home between the years 1887 and 1897. So every time a woman entered the home, one of the managers would segment her story into 15 columns, including the name, her date of birth, her last address, and her religion, etc. The stories of women who entered the home didn't fit neatly into this framework. Indeed, the entries in the register are incomplete and sometimes just inaccurate. And like any written source, there are inconsistencies that are difficult to reconcile, and there are also absences that might never be recovered. The register poses particular challenges as a double mediated source. The women who entered the shelter presented their lives in a particular way to meet the criteria of the sheltering home. And this information was then recorded by middle-class managers who were protecting their own respectability. And most importantly, from this document emerges is a map of Montreal's network of poor relief for women. My dissertation poses two main questions. What can a register tell us about the built environment, and how does employing the register as architectural evidence complicate the way that we think about architecture? In my dissertation, I argue that the register is architectural evidence, just as much as a floor plan, a building, or a photograph, and it challenges our understanding of architecture in several ways. First, it challenges what sources we consider architectural. The register, of course, must always be supplemented by traditional sources like floor plans and elevations and maps. But without this document, we would not know to what extent the architectures of different religious organizations were connected. In some cases, the register points to sites that I have never heard of. Second, the register sharpens our understanding of how women who were struggling in industrializing Montreal, how they moved through space. From the columns received from and where to of the register emerge a network of hospitals, religious buildings, train stations, prisons, and institutions. This network of repurposed and purpose-built architecture forms what architectural historian Marta Gutman calls the charitable landscape. Quote, a landscape made up of transitory sites, informal buildings, as well as grand purpose-built institutions, end quote. The charitable landscape that emerges from the sheltering home register was limited to Catholic and Protestant institutions. And it suggests that while Protestant and Catholic religious bodies did not necessarily cooperate or collaborate at an institutional level, the managers of these institutions were aware of one another and referred women to each other as they saw appropriate. In studying this landscape as a network, instead of isolated institutions, we can observe connections between spaces that would not be available through studying gray literature of these organizations. I created this map through tracing a goat atlas from 1909 and through overlaying a map drafted by engineers with a mental map of spaces that helped women. I intend to make a critical intervention into the history of Montreal's built environment. So I've posited the register as architectural evidence and demonstrated how it can expand into a complex landscape of repurposed and purpose-built spaces. I've included a few buildings within this network on this screen. And as we can see, they are not connected through any particular style or author. The register is the tissue that connects these buildings together to form the charitable landscape of Montreal. Now I want to discuss the sheltering home itself. In the early years of my research, I got a bit obsessed with finding an image of the sheltering home. And to my knowledge, there are no photographs of the home. And I'll be really embarrassed if someone comes up with one because I've looked everywhere. But what I do know is that it was founded in 1887 by Emma Barber, and the property itself was situated at 92 Saint-Germain Street between De la Gauchetière and Dorchester Streets. While the official history of the organization says that 92 Saint-Germain was purchased in 1887, the property deed that is pictured on screen dates the sale to July of 1891. The exterior was clad in stone with brick extensions on the north and west sides of the building. And from the aerial photo on the right, we can see that it had a pitched roof. The rectangular property had a long yard in the back that faced Dufferin Square, the former Protestant burial ground. The home was actually two dwellings that were at some point connected into one. And it's estimated that in a report that I read that the home dates back to the 1850s. It had two floors and contained closed bedrooms, bathrooms, and kitchens. And this is what makes the home distinct from other institutions for poor relief at the time, is that women actually had closed bedrooms, individual bedrooms that they could use instead of sleeping in a larger ward. There was also a mission room used for prayer, a meeting room, and a kitchen on the first floor. And as you can see at the back, there was a garden in which tulips and lilacs grew in the spring. The laundry from the home was done in the workroom, which I think was the brick extension on the west side of the building. The home incorporated in 1897 and was governed by a ladies' committee and a gentlemen's committee. And the constitution of the sheltering home stated that all property was held in the name of the home, and no sale or lease of the home was valid without the approval of at least 8 members of each committee. When reading the official history of the sheltering home, the official history states that it kind of presents this idyllic home scene of Christian respectability. It mentions that there were cookies served and cocoa served and that the laundry was done in the laundry room, and everything was very harmonious. There was prayer every day, etc. This photograph shows us the same kind of idyllic scene painted in the sheltering home's official history. It's not of the Montreal sheltering home, but of the Home for Friendless Women in Ottawa. And I chose to use this photograph because it overlaps with the time period of the register, and it represents the population of the Montreal sheltering home. Virtually all of the women who entered the home were white, although there were about 4 Black women who entered the sheltering home over the 10-year period. Most of them were aged 20 to 30 years old, although there were some very elderly women who stayed there for long periods of time. And there were often babies and children in the sheltering home because women would bring in their children with them. So we know that getting a photograph at this point in history was a big deal. So while this image is posed to be candid, it is still posed. And the image of the organization, the Home for Friendless Women in Ottawa, that it represents is a controlled image. So this is why I think the register is so interesting. A close reading of the register and the visitor book that accompanies it animates the Montreal sheltering home. It reveals that there was also a great deal of drama going on at the home on a daily basis. When women had had enough, some of them would just jump out of the window and run away. Some women would arrive drunk and make scenes or cause so much trouble that the home would gather funds to return them to their home country. These instances present a counter-narrative and complicate the image presented by the official history of the sheltering home, or the documents that they would present to the government to receive funding. British historian Carolyn Steedman observes, quote, "Working class people, their image, their appurtenances were used to tell other people's stories, to tell the story of some kind of bourgeois self," end quote. In the same way that the sanitized photograph of the Home for Friendless Women in Ottawa reflects an image of middle-class managers, this etching by British artist Matthew White Ridley can be seen as a reflection of the upper classes. We see a woman in rags holding her child in her lap on the steps of a home. Behind her, through the bars of an iron fence, we see a cozy indoor scene. The image of the poor woman functions as a cautionary tale of the precarity of respectable life and signifies to the upper classes their literal proximity to poverty, to evoke pity and a sense of duty towards the unfortunate. The register presents an opportunity to situate real women in this landscape according to their stories, not other people's, told by them. We can imagine real women within architecture that was not built with them in mind. One such site is Windsor train station, the Richardsonian Romanesque terminal designed by New York architect Bruce Price. The construction of Windsor Station was driven by the ambitions of the Canadian Pacific Railway's William Van Horn. The station symbolized prosperity, economic expansion, and solidified Montreal as one of the most important commercial hubs in North America. The station's elite status was further emphasized by the proximity to the hotel of the same name. The Windsor Hotel was only a block away from the station and was famous for its elite clientele. However, the register connects the station to the sheltering home and suggests that the glamorous terminal was also an important site for serving class women who arrived in Montreal in need of help. So I was told a few years ago by one of my mentors to never apologize for an image that you use in a slideshow, but I will apologize for this image. It's a map that I made, and I'll explain a bit more about it, but it's very much a work in progress. I would like to add some details. I hope you can see it's a map of Canada. I would like to add some details like provincial boundaries and also the train lines, the original Canadian Pacific train lines. But I'm still getting used to the software. So the size and color of the bubbles correspond to the number of women who arrived from Windsor Station and who later went on to the sheltering home. So we can see that most of the women who arrived to Windsor Station came from smaller villages around Montreal or small towns in Ontario. Some women came from Toronto, but importantly, we can see that women came from each coast. There's a woman who came from St. John, Newfoundland, and also a woman who came from British Columbia near Vancouver. So I think there's this connection between the Canadian Pacific Railway and economic expansion and these women and the sheltering home and the register, but it's not very clear in my mind yet exactly what that connection is. So the second chapter of my dissertation that I'm working on currently is based on a few case studies of women who arrived at Windsor Station. And one of these women is Charlotte Millicent, who is pictured on screen. I'm using this image courtesy of one of her relatives who actually gave me permission to use this image through chat on ancestry.ca. So as a child, Charlotte had been brought to Canada from England with a dozen other children by Louisa Burt, who ran the Knowlton Receiving Home and was the sister of Annie McPherson. Once she was of working age, the Knowlton home found Charlotte a placement as a servant. And then when she was 18, Charlotte became pregnant for reasons that are unclear. It's stated in the register that she was seduced. So we can kind of assume that maybe something happened in the house where she was working as a servant. Unfortunately, servant class women at this time were subject to this kind of misconduct in the homes in which they worked. So since the founder of the sheltering home in Montreal, Emma Barber, who we heard about earlier, had connections to the Knowlton home, it's likely that Louisa Burt contacted Barber about Charlotte and sent her there. She arrived on April 25th, 1896. And we can assume that this was because Charlotte would have had access to the Montreal Maternity Hospital and all of these healthcare services that wouldn't necessarily have been provided to a woman of her class and social status in Knowlton. So in the chapter, I follow Charlotte's journey by train from the countryside in Knowlton, Quebec, through Windsor Station, and then along de la Gauchetière Street in Montreal towards the sheltering home. And this station has never been looked at through a feminist lens. So tracing the journeys of young single women on their way through Windsor Station towards the home allows me to discuss the class and gender implications of Price's design. Another woman who arrived at Windsor Station is Maud C. Williams, and she's known in the register as the missing heiress. Maud arrived by train a month after Charlotte, almost to the day, on May 26, 1896. And she was the daughter of a wealthy insurance commissioner in Stonington, Connecticut. The Hartford Courant newspaper, pictured on screen, reported that she had escaped while staying with a family friend a week earlier, and she made her way to Montreal by train via Vermont. And from the Windsor Station, she was likely directed towards the sheltering home by a conductor, because this was often done for lone women who were arriving to the station at night. Williams fooled the managers of the sheltering home into thinking that she was poor until she was found out and sent home to Connecticut. I think her brother and a nurse came to get her and accompanied her back home. And I was really interested in Maud Williams' story, and I traced her story through census and other sources. And at some point between 1900 and 1910, Williams was actually confined in the Hartford Retreat Insane Asylum, which is pictured on screen, where she lived until her death in 1930. And Maud's Odyssey reveals the instability and mutability of social class during the late 19th century, and that the sheltering home was not only a place for needy women, but also a place for women who arrived looking for a bit of anonymity and perhaps a different life. So now I'll return back to the register. I've talked about this document as a source for mapping and mining personal narratives, but lately I've also had to grapple with the fact that this object has enormous possibilities as a data frame. The register is available as an Excel spreadsheet, and the McCord agreed to let me have a copy when I started my PhD. A few years ago, my supervisor suggested that I use our software to visualize the data and interpret the broader trends of the categories in the register. And I've never really been a computer science person. I never learned JavaScript or anything like that. But through YouTube, online forums, and a few other resources, I have been able to muddle my way through the basics of data cleaning and manipulation to make some very basic visualizations. So in less than a second, R transforms the register with its 15 columns, its 3,000 entries, and countless stories from the lives of women, and it transforms it into this. So to interpret the data of the register, I have to squeeze out personal circumstances, the moral qualifications and expressions of skepticism on behalf of the managers. all of the things that I find so interesting and fun about this source. As I mentioned previously, the register is also incomplete. Many rows have missing information, so some rows are just blank. And although I could cite Caroline Steedman and say that absences and omissions speak through the archive and are important, which I do believe that, but in programming language, these blank cells become NA or not applicable, and they cause a lot of problems when trying to make visualizations. So because of this, a sample population of 1,000 women might only return 100 women once all the rows with NA have been filtered out. This is a screenshot from some recent work I was doing where I homed in on the columns profession and have fallen to try and see how many women of a particular profession had fallen in a specific way. And fallen basically meant like why they were at the shelter. So for this visualization to work, the woman in question, she's either seduced or she's not seduced. The distinctions between what would have been considered the deserving poor, indicated, I think, by qualifications like, quote, under the promise of marriage, are often discarded by this software, or always discarded by this software. But discarding this information doesn't necessarily make the data any more reliable. This is a bar chart that I made that compares the age of Protestant inmates, which is what they called the women at the shelter, to Catholic inmates. Professor Sherry Olson agreed to meet with me in 2019 to discuss some of my findings, which included an earlier version of this graph. She pointed out that the spikes in the data indicate that women, especially the older women, didn't actually know how old they were. They knew they were around 40, 50, 60, etc. And I see a connection between this and the Maud Williams story, in that the data reflects how people present themselves, and people in either good or bad faith are unreliable narrators. And I think this speaks to the need to consider the register as a data frame, a narrative source, and a map all at once. The map from the register is a critical intervention into historical maps of Montreal. The data tells us who said they did what, where, when, why, and the narratives critique and complicate this data. And this brings me to the present state of my research, where I find myself managing the macro of the charitable landscape of Montreal with the micro of the sheltering home at 92 Saint-Urbain Street. I'm trying to reconcile the qualitative data in the form of personal narratives and the quantitative data in the shape of bar charts, chord diagrams, and geocoded maps. I'm constantly zooming out to the big picture, then back to the small picture. And while the big picture of my dissertation can be muddled at times, I contend that if we do not accept artifacts, such as the register, as architectural evidence, then we will miss out on the landscape as it was reported by serving class women. The register in so many ways proves that women were there in a grand train station or in the ward of a hospital or walking through the street in a crowd. And they were real women with real names, birth dates, and distinct personalities. Amazing stories of women who triumphed against the perils of life as a single woman or mother in the industrializing city emerged from this document. Other women were incorrigible, but somehow likable through their truculence. Architectural historian Del Upton, in the preface to his 1996 Madeline about Madeline Edwards, who was a single woman trying to survive in New Orleans, Upton writes, quote, in the face of glib talk of resistance and subversion current in social history scholarship and cultural criticism, Edwards remind us that it is a more common human experience to get by, hoping for small forward steps rather than enormous leaps, and usually achieving neither. Often her tone is painful and occasionally it is desperate, but behind it stood a woman who was tougher than she pretended to be, who knew her mind, understood her possibilities, and was fiercely determined to make the best of both. And I imagine that many, end quote. I imagine that many women who arrived at the sheltering home were a lot like Madeline Edwards. And the register makes clear that in the case of industrializing Montreal, just surviving was a form of resistance. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Laura. C'était... bon, j'ai plusieurs questions, mais je vais... Tu vois, il y a beaucoup d'applaudissements déjà qui arrivent. Et je suis certain qu'il y a beaucoup de questions déjà pour les personnes. Là, je ne vois pas tout le monde dans mon écran. Je ne sais pas si on peut... je vais juste vous mettre en Gallery View. Voilà. Donc, si vous avez des questions, vous pouvez simplement lever la main et prendre la parole, ouvrir votre micro. Laura.
Allô, on a deux Laura sur l'appel aujourd'hui. Hi, Laura, and the other Laura. And I'm jumping in very quickly because I have to go to another meeting, but I just want to say what a fantastic presentation that was. It was so incredibly interesting. And selfishly, I wish I'd heard you speak a few hours ago because I've just been muddling through a history of sanctuary in Montreal where I've been talking about different spaces that people found as places of refuge and how that changed over time. And I'm listening to you speak thinking, I don't need to write this book because you're doing this amazing work. So thank you and congratulations. And I'm so sorry, I was cringing when you talked about losing your material, but hopefully, you know, the second version is all the easier and better. I do have a quick question about the register and then also how you're thinking about these spaces generally. I'm really curious about whether you can tell whether the majority of women who pass through are Canadian born. It looked like a lot of them were maybe first generation UK immigrants. So I'd be curious if the data tells you that. I was also curious if the register, sorry, I have three questions and then I will. I was also curious if the register tells you how long people stayed at the shelter. And I guess the other thing I was thinking about as you were presenting this really fabulous source and the work that you're doing, you know, the story of Maud C. Williams, in some ways is an example of how people make safe spaces for themselves. You know, here you have a woman who is privileged and wealthy and has decided that's not the life that she wants to lead and might appear down and out, you know, to casual observers, but has a much more complicated story. And I'm thinking back to the Jeudi d'Histoire that we had with Wendell Ajete, where he was making this really profound point about not looking at spaces, but actually looking at what people make of the spaces that they move in. And so I realize the register might not be able to tell you a lot about the actual experiences in the shelter, but I am curious about how long people spent there. Anyway, that's a very rambling question and comment, but I just wanted to say it's so interesting and I'm so excited to see where you go with this.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for your questions. They're all really, really good questions. So the first one was how I can, if I can tell from the register if they were Canadian born or born elsewhere. I believe that it does say that. It says where their place of birth. Most women were born in Canada, others in the US, and also from England. And some women, so there were even some Swedish women, but like a very small minority. And also I think a lot of women came from Ireland. Serving class women were from Ireland, working as servants. And how long people stayed at the shelter. It lists the date that they entered and the date that they left. And then another column that says how many times did they enter the shelter. So I'm going to do something with those columns. I haven't really figured out what yet, but it's some women came like 12 times. Like there's 20 times or like over the course, like they were always there. And so there was this one woman who, like, if you look at who, like the manager or the superintendent, whoever's recording, eventually she just stops counting and says like many or like several. And anyways, yes, it does say how many times they were in the shelter and how long they were in the shelter for. And that's really interesting what you say about Maud Williams and connecting it to the Jeudi d'Histoire. I couldn't be at the Jeudi d'Histoire, the previous one, because of the time difference. So I unfortunately couldn't make it. But yeah, Maud Williams is such an interesting person, I think. And I think she was trying to make her life into something different. I read in the article about her, she was like a theater person, like she loved theater. She seemed like a very emotional person. I think she wanted to be an actress. And when she was institutionalized, I think her father died in that period that we don't know where she was. And I think that might have triggered a series of events where she was institutionalized. So yeah, I don't know if I'm answering your question, or I guess I'm just talking now, but it's interesting to follow these people, these women through their lives. And it's weird. I don't know. It's hard to justify, I guess, following her to the insane asylum, like following her to the asylum, because that happens outside of the limits of my dissertation, but I still thought it was somewhat significant to mention where she ended up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Il y a Liz qui a une question et ensuite Magda.
Great, thanks. Laura, I love your research and I'm always excited to see more. And it's interesting having read what I read earlier and now connecting it with this, it's really great. Keep on going.
Thank you.
I have a follow-up question from Laura's, I think, and thinking about this, I think it's like a brilliant way of thinking about Montreal in terms of a charitable landscape and the network that existed. And I'm wondering if you have a sense of how the WCTU pictured their role in that network. So are they thinking of themselves as trying to prepare women perhaps for another charitable institution in that network? Or are they trying to rescue them from the charitable network? And is there a difference? Do you have a sense? And I guess that's the first angle. And then the second, which is directly related, I mean, the WCTU has a pretty conservative reputation. So I'm interested that they even let Catholics in the first place. That's an interesting aspect. And are they trying to have some religious proselytizing? Are they trying to have them have a spiritual renewal and give up alcohol and all the things that go along with their temperance moment?
Thank you for your question. And yeah, there are, okay, sorry, I'm all confused. So how did they picture their role, the WCTU, within this landscape? It's interesting because I don't know how, like, there's this interesting thing that's happening. They have this house, this repurposed dwelling that they've arranged as a domestic space that's a very non-domestic space because it's also an institution, but they're trying to imbue these like middle-class values on these women within the house through laundry and through these kinds of things. So they were, I think, and I think that they were trying to send women back to situations, to serving situations. But the thing is that these were situations from which they arrived from where they had been like abused or like seduced or outraged. So they were putting them back into this system. But you know, what I suppose they thought, what else are we supposed to do? I'm not sure if they were trying to rescue them because they were very tolerant of all kinds of behavior in the register. Women would show up drunk and they wouldn't tolerate drinking within like the institution, but they would really tolerate some bad behavior and they let women back. It was very forgiving. It was very lenient. And that surprised me too, despite the conservative history of the WCTU. Emma Barber founded the institution and she was adamant that they would let in anyone of any like race, religion, or creed. That's what she said. But of course, it's only Catholics and Protestants. And then if a person was from another religion, I think they would just write none. So if someone was from another religion, I don't really think that they would care to know what it was or like record that. And I don't think there was any like, there was also like, I think a Catholic priest was allowed to come once a month in, and they wanted each woman to observe her own faith. So it was very tolerant of, it was Protestant. It was like an evangelical organization, but it was tolerant of and encouraging of Catholic faith. And so it was a really interesting institution because sometimes I don't even picture it as part of the WCTU. So it was founded by it had connections to the WCTU, but it really just seemed to me like a triage center for women, trying to figure out where to send them next and whether that was to a home or to a different institution or to, elsewhere. So I'm not sure if that answers your question.
That's great. And I think it's really super interesting that that's how it runs. I don't think that's the norm in my experience of understanding charitable institutions in Montreal. I think that it's pretty interesting.
Yeah. A lot of women also arrived from, you know, houses of ill fame, like brothels, and they would come in and out and in and out. And I think that I'm still trying to look into how they got these women there, or who it was who was bringing them from these places. But I want to look into that as part of one of the chapters as well.
Et donc, on a une question de Magda et ensuite de Dan.
Thank you, Laura. That was great. I loved your talk, loved the images. I just wanted to see all the other pages of the register too. It's really a great image that invites us into the talk. I was interested in the fact that most of the women, or the majority of the women that you were able to track through the register, were between the ages of 20 and 30. And I wonder if this is because other institutions existed in Montreal for older women. This speaks to Liz's question a little bit about this charitable landscape. Actually, you know, 3 charitable landscapes, or a landscape that's divided among Catholics, Catholics, Protestants, Jews. So is it that older women in their 40s or 50s who would have been considered almost elderly at that time, would they have been sent to houses of refuge, to homes for the elderly? Is it that this sheltering home accepted women with children, which wasn't the case with other institutions? Because that strikes me as quite significant, that these are mostly women in their 20s.
Mm-hmm. I think there was St. Bridget's Refuge, which is a Catholic institution, and that was for, I think it was originally for elderly people. It was for elderly people originally, but they let in, you know, a lot of different, like, men and women. St. Bridget's also let in men, which was very unusual for charitable institutions at the time. And I think that at the time that I'm studying, there was just this, and Sherry, there was an article, Sherry Olsen, Danielle Gavreau, and Patricia Thornton wrote this article, I think The Harsh Welcome of an Industrial City, and they speak to the huge influx of young women at the time, and how, you know, a lot of women arrived from England, from Ireland, from elsewhere, in Canada, and that led to like a huge population boom, and also the timing and like major life events changed. This is one of the findings from that paper. The timing of major life events changed, so such as marriage, etc. So it happened that there was this huge section of, or a huge population of women who participated in the workforce, and so therefore there's like there weren't enough jobs, I don't think. So I think a lot of women moved to Montreal and didn't necessarily have a job, or fell on hard times, etc. And for letting kids in, it really just seemed like, I don't know if they had a policy. Like it kind of just seemed like they, you know, they let children in because the Protestant Orphan Asylum, or, you know, whichever other institution didn't have a room for the children, and I think that because of the like maternalistic ideology of the WCTU and of evangelical Protestantism, I think they thought it was better. I think they thought it was better for the children to stay with them, to stay with their mothers. So I think that could account for the children there. But I read the visitor book, and on any given day, there was like, I think around like 10 to 12 women, and then quite a few children usually. And some children were born in the home. Like some children were born in the home, some children died in the home. Like this home was everything. It was a hospital, it was a home, it was a you know, source, it was like a referral center, like it was a lot of different things.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Dan?
Thank you, Laura. I really enjoyed your talk. I thought it's just fascinating. I can't wait to see what comes of this. And I feel a special affinity to the WCTU because my office at Ryerson looks out, not that I've been in my office in like a year, but it looks out at Toronto's WCTU on Gerrard Street. So I feel like I'm always sort of watching over the WCTU. I have two sort of quick questions. The first is, have you ever thought of seeing if you could find any of the women in this register from sort of lower court police records from the time, and sort of seeing if these are also women who are coming into contact with law enforcement and police and stuff like that. And my other question was thinking about this wonderful idea of the charitable landscape, which I was really taken with. How was do you know anything about the history of the building itself? Like, how was that property acquired? Because I know this is part of the city that was, you know, already developed sort of, I mean, I mostly know about the mid-century city. So, you know, this was an area that was developed in the mid-19th century. So wondering if you knew anything about how it came into the possession of the WCTU, and whether they, you know, I know you talked a little bit about the building's history at the beginning, but I wondered more about that.
Thank you. I just wanted to also say the charitable landscape isn't, I know I wanted to make that really clear. It's not my idea. Yeah, it's Marta Gutman wrote a book about it, and I think in 2014, it's actually about charitable landscapes of Oakland for children. So it's a really interesting book. And have I thought to find police records? I haven't. I haven't been looking at those records. I've been looking just at census, and I've been really focused on tracking the movement of these women throughout the city. But I think that that's definitely something that I could look for, because I'm sure a lot of them were from jail. A lot of them were in and out of jail, I think. And a lot of them were very troubled women. So I'm sure they would show up in the court documents. And also police in the where from column, it will say where they're from, but it'll also, oh yeah, there's also like a brought by column, like who brought them. So the police or the police matron would often bring women in. I think they would just find women and not know what to do with them. Well, maybe not know, maybe they were nearby or something, and they would bring them in. So there's a definite connection to law enforcement. And the history of the building itself, the land belonged to a man, James Hurl, and I don't know that much about him, James G. Hurl, and he owned the land like as far back as 1850, like that's who the land belonged to. And it was bought, as I mentioned, in 1891 by Emma Barber and also Charles Alexander, who I'm not entirely sure on their relationship, but I think he is either the husband of someone who's on the committee or maybe a close friend of Emma Barber. So he was present, the land was sold to him and Emma Barber. And the building itself, it was the sheltering home until 1910, from around 1887 to 1910. And it was called the WCTU sheltering home till then. And I think after that, it was just called the sheltering home. In the 1950s, they moved to a building on Lincoln Street because the building was very run down and they needed a bigger institution for the work that they were trying to do. And now the Guy Favre complex is on top of it. That's what I think it was eventually raised for.
Yeah.
But other than that, I don't know that much about the building. I've tried to go, I went around, before I left Montreal, I kind of consulted a map and saw some places that were built around the same time and tried to do some kind of like, archaeological kind of, I documented them and tried to figure out what it would look like. And I'd like to make a drawing, an architectural drawing or something at one point of what I think it would have looked like. But unfortunately, I really don't know that much about it. I don't know much more about the history of it.
Thanks. That's fascinating.
Erika qui a levé la main aussi.
Yeah, hi. So as the non-historian in the group, I just want to say thanks, Laura. Like, that was really interesting. I was all on board. I understood what you were saying. I was really into it. And so I don't know what that means to you, but it was very accessible from the point of view from my point of view. I thought it was fascinating. You kind of mentioned very briefly about Windsor Station and how Windsor Station had never been looked at from a feminist lens before, and the experience from an architectural point of view, the experience of what it was like to go into Windsor Station or to take the train in there, arrive late at night. as a woman who would ultimately go to one of these shelters. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that. Sounds like that was a subject of a previous chapter, and it might be irrelevant for our discussion here, but I just thought that was fascinating. And so if you could say something more about that, I'd be really interested.
So Windsor Station, yeah, it is the current chapter that I'm working on, and I'm trying to figure out, in a previous iteration of that chapter, I was writing just about Charlotte and these other women arriving there, and I didn't stay for very long on Windsor Station, and they would kind of leave. And my supervisor said, you know, they weren't just there. They were like, they were just there and then they left, you know, like what was it like for them in this space? And so it's something that it's not super developed, but I kind of, in the writing that I've done so far, I kind of follow Charlotte, because Charlotte was like a serving class woman who was arriving in this really opulent station. And you see in the image of the general waiting room, it's like very grand, and like there are these like hardwood floors. And then when you move past towards the exit, there's this ladies' waiting room with like a fireplace and this beautiful furniture and these things like that. And so I kind of imagine through writing from Charlotte's perspective, like what direction she moves and how does she choose to walk through it, and what is she thinking as a pregnant serving class woman walking through this place, probably with like a lot of wealthier people as well, because wealthy people would arrive and go to the Windsor Station, or the Windsor Hotel, they would just walk straight through. So it's not fully developed in my head where I'm going with it. I'm still writing it, but it is, I'm thank you for asking about it. It is, I think it is an interesting part of it and something that I should expand on more.
Sorry to jump in, but I think, you know, you can, there's also these like people like the Home for Friendless Women. They actually had people like stationed at Windsor Station trying to pick up these friendless, homeless women. So it'd be interesting to think about that as well.
Yeah, being people intercepting, keeping their eye out for single women. Yeah. With
connections to all like the white slave kind of discourse and stuff. I'm thinking of Judith Walkowitz. And,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Il y a Brian qui a levé la main aussi, ouais.
I really enjoyed this, and for me, it's a whole different way of looking at the issue of poor relief in Montreal. I always wondered about Windsor Station, and I always connected it to the port and immigration. And my own grandmother was a very typical poor English product of a work home in Birmingham. But the point being that she arrived in the Port of Montreal, got up to the station, and then was shuttled off to Winnipeg, where she lived the rest of her life. But it always struck me, and you're really speaking to it, that there must be thousands of people coming from the port up into the train station, Windsor Station, and spending a night or two or three or four, I have no idea. But I wonder if that is not an important avenue. Secondly, I wonder the records of the Protestant Orphan Asylum, if there is not a cross-indexing of the girls who came through the Protestant Orphan Asylum and maybe other institutions that might be useful. And my final question would be, I find the name of the home so interesting, Sheltering Home. It seems so, I was going to say feminine, which may be much too pejorative, but when you think of how harsh so many of the names are, asylum, Christian, union, temperance, and yet you give us a picture of a very human, understanding, respectful place that I would have liked to have learned more about the presumably women who were running it and their ideology, which stands in sharp contrast to the sort of attitudes which I might have expected them to have. But congratulations on the work. I find it quite very fascinating.
Thank you so much. You're absolutely right about Windsor Station and about the connection from the port to Windsor Station. Charlotte Millicent actually arrived to Montreal as a child at the port. She took the Allen line, which was the ship, the passenger ship that a lot of the British home children came on. And so I don't think when she arrived in Montreal, I can't remember off the top of my head exactly what year that was, but I don't know if Windsor Station would have been built yet. But in any case, she would have gone to the train station, and then she was probably sent to Knowlton. So I think that probably happened. You're exactly right too, or that was the situation of a lot of women, or who arrived maybe as young women and then went to Windsor Station and then were sent elsewhere, and then maybe even returned to Windsor Station under different circumstances. So that's really interesting, and I'm going to look into that. As for cross-indexing to the Protestant Orphan Asylum, I haven't done that. I haven't accessed those. I haven't accessed the Protestant Orphan Asylum registers or that information. I'm going to be making a trip back to Montreal in the summer. Hopefully the archives will be open again, and I'll be able to make some appointments to go see some things, because I need to see some things. I need to finish my dissertation. And the name of the home, the sheltering home, it is very feminine. It's very like maternal and very inviting. And I went to Frances Willard House archive, which is in Evanston. And there I was going through the microfiche through the Union Signal, the WCTU newspaper. And I found the article that mentions the sheltering home. And it calls it a life-saving station in Montreal. And apparently at one point there were like gold letters written across the home that announced it as the WCTU sheltering home. And it was actually started in Emma Barber's living room. Like, she opened her own sitting room to these women. It was for working women on their day off, so they wouldn't go to the bar or anything like that. So she would invite them into her sitting room, and then it evolved from this. So I think it carried that very like kind of soft, encouraging living room feel to a larger scale. And I think it never really lost that. As you say, like the other institutions, like the Home for Friendless Women is a brutal name for a place. Like it's a total brutal name. It's just really, really harsh. And to make a woman profess herself as friendless in order to get into a place, it's just very, it's really sad. Yes, the sheltering home, I think, was definitely a really special place compared to the other institutions, but I don't think it was all good. Like, I think there definitely were, I'm worried about painting it as too welcoming, because it is, I'm reading it through the register that is mediated by these women who ran it, who wanted to uphold a certain image. So it's still, I just trailed off. I don't know where I'm going, but yeah, it is a very interesting institution in the context of Montreal.
I wonder about the role of, an individual versus an organization, right? So introducing this idea that Anna was bringing women into her own home presents a very particular kind of individual to envision this in the first place, right? Versus the greater WCTU's sort of mechanism. I have no answers. It's just a comment that it's an interesting thing to think about what her individual personality and goals would have done to shape the home.
Well, Emma Barber worked at, I think she was the superintendent for the Milton Receiving Home for a long time. And so that was her connection to that home. That was her connection to Louisa Burt. And so I think that she seemed very devoted to children. And then when they became young adults, she felt, I think she as a person and the sheltering home as an organization were very protective of women. And they even, they would go to bat for women, like in court, like they would, you know, if the husbands like abandoned or like did wrong against their wives or something, like they would support them in court and through legal avenues and financially. And so, yeah, it was a very supportive place. And I don't know that much about Emma Barber. I've read a bit about her biography, or there's not like that much information about her that I could find outside of her like addresses in various places. But she did seem like a very like warm person, and like that was very important to her to protect women at a time when and also maybe not protect women like individually as people, but also contribute to the broader like Christian project of protecting women in order to be mothers, in order to support the idyllic family life in the home.
Je ne sais pas si on peut continuer un petit peu. Moi, j'aimerais juste une mini-question. C'est que, un peu comme Magda disait, en voyant le registre, on avait le goût un peu de tourner les pages pour, moi surtout pour regarder la colonne de droite, de voir où les gens venaient. Dans la première que tu as montrée, il y avait prison, beaucoup, fresh air. Donc, je serais curieux de voir juste, parce qu'après ça, il y avait la carte. Et là, je serais curieux juste de voir, juste me donner un peu un aperçu de la diversité du landscape ou peut-être des lieux aussi qui sont plus originaux que tu t'attendais pas à retrouver là. Et j'avais aussi peut-être une question sur les départs. Il n'y a pas de notes sur les raisons des départs non plus dans les...
I'll answer in English just because I'm comfortable. There was a column for observations, and sometimes it would list like why they left or the reason for which they left. Or the reason that they had to go there. I'm working on, in this software that I was mentioning, what's so appealing about R is that it can do what ArcGIS and geographic software can do all in one software. So my ambition is to make a map of Montreal and its environs, and to geocode the locations, and then to create a bubble map with like a lot of information on it that shows us where they came from. Not only in Montreal, but outside of Montreal at the Fresh Air Fund, which the Fresh Air Fund was like a situation in the countryside where women would go to benefit, I guess, from the fresh air, to go and kind of like it seems like kind of like, well, I suppose at that time, like fresh air was seen as like very, very healthy. And so it was like, I think some kind of like a retreat for serving class women. What was the second part of your question? I'm sorry.
C'était plus en général une espèce d'envie de savoir un peu les autres lieux d'où venaient ces femmes-là et les liens avec les autres institutions du paysage charitable. Je ne sais pas comment il a été traduit en français.
Mm-hmm.
Donc, de regarder s'il y avait les autres institutions d'où venaient les femmes et c'est ça, leur relation avec d'autres.
I did make this is one of the things I lost in my software fiasco, but I did make it's called a chord diagram, and it's like this circle, and it shows with different widths, like the links between the institutions, like from like how the woman would go through the sheltering home. And I was really proud of it because it's interactive. And when you clicked on one of the strings, it would turn red, and you could see how many, or one of the institutions, it would highlight the strings and to see where the women, like the particular path that women took. And I showed it to Sherry Olson when I met with her, and she said that it was really, she's like, well, it's pretty, but like I don't understand what I'm looking at. So it's difficult to like, I think, show all of that at once in one diagram, but that's my ambition, is to try and find a way to visualize it in a way that makes sense. Because in the end, I think that a big part of the dissertation just really is looking at movement and looking at movement from one place to another. And I think that's the focus. That's what's always been, I think, really interesting to me, above all in the dissertation.
Merci.
Merci.
Est-ce qu'il y a des questions qui restent? Sinon, ben, Laura, j'ai oublié de souligner qu'elle était notre responsable des médias sociaux aussi. Donc, vous pouvez la contacter tout le temps si vous avez d'autres questions. Donc, sinon, ben,
I'm sorry. I forgot to post my own event on Twitter. I forgot to post.
Alors, ben, merci beaucoup, Laura. C'était vraiment, vraiment fascinant, vraiment bien. Notre prochain M&M va être, ça va être le 16 avril. Donc, il va y avoir une petite pause. C'est possible qu'il y ait une conférence qui s'intercale, mais on vous tiendra au courant et on vous enverra l'invitation à ce moment-là. Donc, merci beaucoup, Laura. Merci tout le monde pour vos questions.
Thanks, Laura.